some of you have the translations of one of my articles. But today I want to mainly make two major points. Because after writing these articles, a number of questions were raised from various left-oriented friends, and I thought it would be good to clarify those points. One is about what we mean by neoliberalism, and particularly what we mean by accumulation, by dispossession. And I will explain that. So that is a more theoretical question about what we mean by neoliberalism and accumulation by dispossession. The second point is about the continuities and the difference or the shift between the Rajapaksa regime and the new regime that is being consolidated, for short maybe we can say the Vikramasinghe regime. In other words, what are the continuities and what are the differences between these two regimes? So that is a historical point. So I want to mainly focus on these 2 points, and maybe we can also discuss that during the discussion. Now, what do we mean by neoliberalism? I would argue that neoliberalism is the latest phase of capitalism. Now, many of you might remember Lenin talking about imperialism. That was almost 100 years ago when he thought of imperialism as the latest phase of capitalism at that time. Since the late 1970s, the kind of phase of capitalism that we have is what many people call neoliberalism. And what is unique or characteristic about neoliberalism, and it comes out of the crisis in the 1970s. So after the Second World War, there was a long boom, particularly in the Western countries. There was very high growth. But in the 1970s, there's a major global economic crisis and a downturn. I think many of you might remember the oil shock, which is what a lot of us think of the downturn. But in general, profits had fallen in the 1970s. It was a major crisis for capitalism. And in that context, the capitalist leaders around the world took forward a particular strategy of renewing accumulation, of renewing increasing returns to capital. And that strategy was to give importance to finance capital. When we're thinking of capital, we can think of, for example, capital also has different characteristics. There is industrial capital, which is used, for example, in building industries and building factories. There is, in an earlier phase, merchant capital, which was involved in trade. But here, importance was given to finance capital or banking capital. And finance capital was given a lot of importance to restart the accumulation process, which was in crisis. And I borrow a lot from the Marxist geographer David Harvey, who defines neoliberalism as a class project of finance capital. In other words, capitalism was reconfigured in a way that the profits went to a large extent to finance capital or banking capital as opposed to, say, industrial capital. So the emphasis also after the 1970s was on financialization, how to expand the global financial markets, how to make sure stock markets became important, how to make sure that bond markets became important. And with that financialization, also the other major characteristic of neoliberalism was urbanization. Because when finance went across borders to different countries, it had to be absorbed in something, and it was often absorbed in urban construction. It wasn't absorbed in more factories, but it was absorbed in, and that is what I would say we've also seen in Sri Lanka in the late 1970s, or even in recent years, the emphasis on construction, infrastructure construction, but also in the city. But this financial characteristic of neoliberal capitalism also came with another process of accumulation. Now, normally when we think of capitalism and accumulation, what happens is that there is the worker, the labor, who is exploited, by which capital is accumulated. So in other words, a worker goes to a factory and works 8 hours a day, but what the worker is paid might only be half of the value of labor that he puts in. The other half is exploited by the capitalist, and that is how capital accumulates. That has been true of capitalism since it emerged almost 250 years ago. But with neoliberalism, there is another dynamic. That dynamic continues, but another dynamic emerges, which David Harvey has called accumulation by dispossession. And before I come to that, this is not the first time that this happened. At the very emergence of capitalism, there was something called primitive accumulation. Primitive accumulation is when, for example, people were chased off their land to the cities, and there was, for example, in Britain, the enclosure movement, or through colonial kind of conquests, people's wealth was taken away. So that kind of accumulation, primitive accumulation, is where you go and grab the people's wealth. And that initial grabbing of wealth was important for capitalism to get started 250 years ago. It was that accumulated wealth that was invested, and then slowly industrial capital gained ground. Now what David Harvey argues is that since the late 70s, with the emergence of neoliberalism, we have a similar process, what he calls accumulation by dispossession. In other words, people have assets, people have wealth, which is grabbed by finance capital through different mechanisms. It might be through land grabs, as we see in many parts of the world, where people's land is taken away, sometimes by brute force, sometimes by getting them to mortgage it. But wealth is accumulated not only in the labor process, but people's wealth, people's entitlements. What do we mean by entitlements? It could be even something like people who have access to free education, which is a socially important form of wealth. But suddenly, if we decide to privatize those schools and people have to pay for it, they have also been dispossessed of an important entitlement. So, in other words, for example, I can give another example. In the rural north after the war, for example, through extreme forms of financialization and with gold prices going up, everybody went and pawned their jewelry. Gold in rural societies is an important asset. And when they pawned all that jewelry and when they lose it, they are dispossessed of an important asset, but it goes towards the accumulation of banks that had been pawning the gold. So this is the process of accumulation by dispossession. So now with neoliberal capitalism, the same kind of exploitation of labor continues. At the same time, there is accumulation by taking away people's wealth and assets and entitlements. I think this is an important theoretical point as we think of the way in which capitalism has been impacting Sri Lanka over the last 30 years, and it's likely to impact Sri Lanka over the next few years. Now I come to the historical point. Is there a continuity between the Rajapaksa regime and the newly emergent Wickremesinghe regime in terms of economic policies? And if there are any, what are the differences between the two regimes? Now all of us, I think, would agree that 1977, when JR emerged in that landslide victory, was an extremely important moment and a major shift in the kind of capitalism that was here in Sri Lanka, with liberalization. And I would call that the first wave of Neo-Liberalism. It's that kind of economic policies that came about in many parts of the world, not just Sri Lanka. The same thing was happening under Thatcher in England, Reagan in the US, a little bit earlier, Pinochet, when he came to power in Chile through a military coup. Many of them took forward these same policies, responding to the global situation, what I mentioned earlier, as a major economic crisis. And what JR did was to open the markets, trade liberalization, financial liberalization. There was a major thrust of construction, not only in terms of the accelerated Mahabali scheme, but there was also housing construction. There was then the free trade zones. So that was the first wave of neoliberalism. But then many of the Sri Lankan scholars like Kadiragamar and Dunham, for example, say the next phase of reforms, the second wave of reforms, they say, came under Premadasa between 1989 and 93. And of course, there was a move towards further liberalization under Premadasa. But I would argue that that wasn't as major change in Sri Lanka because of the war. The ability for Premadasa to drastically accelerate these kinds of economic reforms were not possible because the defense budget had to be made much larger. And so they had to move slowly, but the initial set of reforms unleashed by JR in 1977 continued. So that first wave of neoliberalism continued from 1977. And the real opportunity for a major shift came in 2002, when there was some thinking that the war was coming to an end with the Norwegian peace process. A very Western-friendly regime in the form of Ranil Wickremesinghe's regime came to power. And many of you have heard about Regaining Sri Lanka, the poverty reduction strategy program, which they put forward, which is about extensive reforms. That could have become really the second wave of reforms, but it was not possible because in 2004, for various reasons, maybe opposition to the economic reforms, maybe because the South saw Ranil as appeasing the LTT too much. Ranil was defeated in 2004, so those reforms could not be taken forward. It was only with Mahinda Rajapaksa, not during his first term, but during his second term, with the end of the war, and when he said he was going to solve all of Sri Lanka's problems with development, that I would argue that a second wave of neoliberalism emerged. And it could emerge then because for that kind of drastic change, there needs to be some level of national stability. There also has to be favorable global conditions and a strong regime that is willing to take forward that kind of a neoliberal reform process, because it was bound to be a lot of resistance to it. And what we saw in 2009, soon after the war, was Mahinda going for an IMF standby arrangement, which gave him the credibility with global capital, so that global capital felt comfortable coming to Sri Lanka. There was increasing financialization, and Sri Lanka was much more integrated with the global capital markets. Sri Lanka started floating what were called sovereign bonds on a very large scale. Sri Lankan banks also started to float bonds on the scale of billions of dollars. And there was a major integration in the global capital markets. And as you all know, the beautification of Colombo, urbanization was also taken forward. So there was in many ways this kind of a second wave of neoliberalism, even though Mahinda Rajapaksa himself often said, including in his 2008 budget, I think, saying that he's not a neoliberal. He actually said, we are not neoliberals, though he was ready to take forward those policies, preempting any kind of critique of Mahinda Rajapaksa as also taking forward neoliberalism. Now, I would argue that what Mahinda Rajapaksa initiated in 2010 in terms of financialization and urbanization, which were in fact piecemeal implementation of the Regaining Sri Lanka proposals that Ranil himself had put forward in 2002, that they not only set Sri Lanka on the path of a much more faster acceleration of neoliberalism, they are what the current government is building on in these most recent budget proposals. And not only are they going to build on that, they are also planning to liberalize other aspects of our economy. So all three what we call factors of production, whether it's capital, land or labor, are going to be further reshaped, transformed with this new project. So not only is there going to be more financialization, just as in 2014 with Mahinda Rajapaksa, the main thrust of their economic policies was financial consolidation, major mergers of banks, for example. That kind of mergers of banks are again now being repeated in this budget. They're also looking to take it much further. They want to financialize pensions and insurance, because that is the big game in terms of financialization. Around the world, insurance funds and pension funds, these are the biggest savings that middle class societies have, and those can be brought into the financial markets and speculated. Now, on some things this government has realized, what I mentioned in terms of pawning, for example, they have realized that probably much of the gold has already been pawned and capital has accumulated. So they have said now for banks to reduce their pawning exposure to 5%. I remember when I was doing some research in Jaffna about 3 years ago, for some of the bank branches, as much as 65% of their revenues came from pawning. That is how important pawning was, but much of that wealth has been accumulated through that process of dispossession. So they're reducing the emphasis on pawning, similarly with lease hire purchasing, which has led to huge amount of indebtedness to the point where people are unable to make their payments, so it has become non-performing loans for banks. On the other hand, in terms of financialization, they want to emphasize these kinds of the pension and insurance industries. Next, in terms of land, this is the kind of in many ways the new kind of frontier in terms of accumulation. There are numerous references to land in this budget. What you might have seen that what they want to do is they want to not only permit lands that people have held for 10 years into private lands, They want to use even lands held by schools and so on for private-public partnerships in agriculture, because land is even more than even pensions and other kinds of savings. Lands are the largest assets that rural people have. It's their little plot of land where they do agriculture and the housing land. And what this budget seeks to do is to create a market in land as well. And finally, they are also thinking of extensive labor reforms. And of course, they are being careful here. They haven't said what all that will entail. But the problems with budgets is that there are many things that are said in a budget, and there are many things that are not said in a budget. What is said in a budget is how much the government is going to spend and how much the government is going to collect as revenues. What they don't have to say is what are the kind of legal changes they're going to bring about for land or labor, how they're going to change the labor regime, for example, other than to say that it has to become much more flexible. They want an education system that creates a kind of a labor market. But I think from the initial thrust, it's clear where the policies are headed. So to sum up, I would say there are very deep continuities in terms of neoliberalism between the Rajapaksa regime and the newly emergent Wickremesinghe regime, particularly in terms of the process of financialization and urbanization. But there are also some differences. It could further accelerate in terms of these kinds of reforms when it comes to particularly land and labor, and which we have to follow very carefully what kind of developments there will be in the year or two ahead. Thank you.